Alright, in this video we're going to take a look at how to make graphs using Google Sheets. So first things first, if you have your tables set up right, your graph doesn't need to be a whole lot of work at all. Just to give you an example, I've got my number of spaghetti strands and then the trials listed here. So this is the number of washers that broke the spaghetti for each trial. Always make sure to have your independent variable listed in the first column. Your dependent variable should come in the second or subsequent columns there. So if it's always independent then dependent, your graph will work best. You need to tell your Google Sheets what boxes to use to make your graph. So instead of just clicking on this box and then making your chart, I'm going to go ahead and highlight all the boxes that we want. And I'm going to either click Insert Chart here, or you can go to Insert, and then you can click on Chart here. Same way, either place. Once I do that, I get something that looks like this. It doesn't really seem to fit what I want, so I'm going to go to Chart Type, and I'm going to change this. A scatter plot is a very common type of graph used in science classes and often math classes too. So that might be a good one to start with, and then from there you can change it to line or bar graph if you need to. This is a pretty good graph. I see though that we've got, oh gosh, a whole lot for heading. I'm not seeing a line, a y-axis label over here. We do have the number of spaghetti strands down here. If you were to keep this as your graph, you need to do a few things. Let's get rid of me for a second here. Can I do that? I don't know if I can do that. Okay. So a couple of things that you're going to need here. If you go into Customize, you're going to need a title at the top, so we can go to Chart and Axis Titles. You'll probably need to create your own title here. A good idea for a title is always independent versus dependent variable. So our independent variable was number of spaghetti strands versus, and then we already have number of washers listed there, but I'm going to delete everything after number of washers that broke. Okay, so click on this and delete everything that comes after that. We want this to be a very concise, as possible for our title. So number of spaghetti strands versus number of washers. This looks like each of your series, each of your trials are listed in a different color. This works. You would need to, if you're going to stick with this type of graph, you would need to include vertical axis titles. So this would be number of washers that broke the spaghetti strands. And then last thing I'm thinking, I see that this goes from 5, 10, 15, 20. I see that we didn't actually have a 0 on here, but I think it would make sense to include a 0. So I'm going to go to the horizontal axis, and we want our minimum value to be a 0. A lot of times, if your graph doesn't include it automatically, if you put it in, it just makes sense. Plus, you get this nice, clean, L-shaped axis that has your origin listed there. If you want negative values, this would be where you could do that. You could plug in -5 and it would start below that. It doesn't really make sense in our case because you can't have negative spaghetti strands. Okay, that's all fine and good, but what if you don't want to have multiple series on here? What if you want to have this represented? I'm going to delete this graph for just a second. What if we want to have just a single set of points? One good way to do that is to create an average here. So in our last video, we talked about how to use a function to get your averages. I would usually suggest to create an average column so that you have an independent variable and an average of your dependent variables. So this is every time we did 3 strands, this was our average. All the times we tested 7 strands, this was our average, and so on. So I'm going to highlight these and insert a chart. It already assumed that we have a scatter plot, and check this out, guys. Since we have a more concise setup, we have a little less data to work with, our Google Sheets already knows what our title should be and our y-axis and our x-axis labels. I would still go into our horizontal axis and include the minimum value of 0, just to give that a nice starting point here. We like to have our origin right there at 0, 0. In addition, if you are asked to make a trend line or find an equation for the trend line, we can find that by going up to the top. Can you see series? Let's click on series, and I'm going to say, hey, show us a trend line for this data set. That's going to include that in there. If you ever need to calculate an equation for this, go to the label and say, yup. Let's label this equation by using, label the trend line using the equation. This should normally be in slope-intercept form, so y equals this, y equals 3.31 times x. The asterisk is the times symbol, the x is the variable for the x-axis. So y equals 3.31x plus 9.41. Feel free to change the color if you need to. If you don't want this to be a scatter plot, you could change this into any other type of graph that you can imagine that you want. In this case, I'm going to leave it as a scatter plot, but just letting you know that you've got some options here. This one I think might be better off. What if we just did something like names and salaries? Might be better off doing something like a bar chart for this one. Column chart is I think what they call it. So you've got your names listed here and your salaries listed there. More of a comparison instead of a trend over time. All right, I think that's the basics of our graphing. Let me know if you've got questions on anything related to graphing.